So today, welcome everybody. Today we have Steve Chung, um, who is first and foremost, the most important fact you need to know about. He's a PhD from UCI. So this is a bit of a homecoming, however virtual. Stephen is an associate professor in East Asian Studies at Princeton University and associate faculty in comparative literature and chair of the University Committee for Film Studies. His research and teaching interests range widely from Korean and East Asian film and media to global histories of political and religious conversion to traditions in film theory and critical theory. His first book, Split Screen Korea, Shincheonji and Post-War Cinema, was published in 2014 and won that year's Association for Asian Studies Prize for Best Book in Korean Studies. The book explored the aesthetic and political terrain of the post-colonial and post-war Korean peninsula through the work of filmmaker Shincheonji. His current research tracks the circulation and reconfiguration of audiovisual technologies throughout the Cold War in East and Southeast Asia. Without further ado, let me turn things over to Steve. And I'm sorry, Steve, but you'll just have to imagine the thunderous applause that you'd be otherwise hearing if you were here in Irvine in person.
Thanks so much, Joe. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be back virtually, at least. Thanks also to Juhoon for smoothing out all the administrative and technical stuff. Yeah, I think it's my first time returning to Irvine in maybe close to a decade. And it feels great because it feels like a kid again in a way. Particularly because, you know, I'm creeping up on 50, I mean, in a couple of years, and feeling my age, feeling very serious adult where I am. And to be back in Irvine is pretty heartening. I'm just gonna call this up. So the talk is kind of has a convoluted title, and I was working last night to sort of de-densify some of the language. But it belongs to a project that I've been working on the last couple of years, but much more intensely over the last year or so. That sort of began as a kind of genealogy of discourses around conversion and brainwashing that I noticed, what I couldn't help but notice, especially in relation to film, was a dominant trope from at least the late colonial period to perhaps the 90s or so. And it took a number of different twists, and it's a difficult project for me because it takes me into areas like this paper, this particular chapter did, into a field that I have very little experience around, namely religious studies. But it's been quite energizing. So it's still a work in progress, and it's quite reactive in a sense. It's the first bit of research that I've done in a long time that is engaging the contemporary, as you'll see as I begin reading. So I am going to be reading and sharing some images along the way. So let me just begin. So the title of the paper is Conversion Logistics, Technologies of Belief Contagion and Containment in Contemporary Korea. In February 2020,
Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt you before you begin, but your screen is not shared right now. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna.
Okay, I didn't.
Yeah. I hope it's gonna be less chaotic than I anticipate it will be to turn off and on the share screen. So forgive me for the boring read, but in February 2020, the extensiveness and rigor of a new religious movement in Korea came to the surface in a most spectacular way. Beginning with the identification of confirmed case 31 on February 18th, reports in the press, through social media, and in newly launched daily public briefings, began to proliferate about Shincheonji and the likelihood that its Tegu congregations could become vectors for a super spread of the theretofore low-intensity coronavirus pandemic. Within a matter of days, the number of confirmed cases associated with the organization increased exponentially from approximately 20 on February 18th to over 100 on February 22nd, to a peak of around 600 new cases on February 28th. The alarming daily and even hourly uptick in infections over these early weeks was the detonation point for an explosion of media reports, legal actions, public health interventions, anguished rumor, heady speculation, and outbreaks of violence around the still mostly obscure religious movement. Accounts of its scope fluctuated, with estimates of membership ranging from just over 100,000 to well over 300,000. Tallies of its facilities pegged at over 1,500 across 200 domestic and international regions, and especially distressing in the throes of the crisis, claims that its membership in China, with a handful of centers in Wuhan, was likely greater than 100,000. Perhaps most troubling for the epidemiologists attempting to track the spread and the residents in Tegu and the surrounding region was the retroactivity and reach of successive revelations of contagion. It was only on February 25th that news surfaced of the January 27th COVID-19 diagnosis and January 31st death of Shincheonji founder Lee Man-hee's older brother, recently returned from Wuhan, and his well-attended funeral at a Tegu hospital, later confirmed to be a prolific spreading event. One day earlier saw the exposure of both the district supervisor for Tegu's district response and the wife of Tegu chapter of the sprawling Korean Teachers Federation in their membership in Shincheonji following their own and their respective family members' diagnoses. With the rate of infection in Tegu, while the rate of infection in Tegu and around the country dropped dramatically through the month of March, by the end of April, the final tally recorded 4,261 confirmed cases associated with Shincheonji out of a total of 6,852 in Tegu alone. Korea was at that point still a leading hotspot in the global pandemic, second only to Italy in its infection rates, and in the heat of coordinating a comprehensive public health response that would strive to reverse the setback and stain of this early outbreak. Let me share some images. Oops. I'm sharing, right? Yes. But well before the pandemic, Shincheonji had already been saturated with the language of disease and virality. Umbrella Protestant and Catholic associations like the Christian Council of Korea, the National Council of Churches in Korea, and the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Korea, branding it a heretical cult, had since the early 2000s issued a series of formal warnings about Shincheonji's doctrinal corruptions and invasive evangelical practices. An anti-Shincheonji force was created as early as 2014 by the Christian Broadcast Service and launched its headline Shincheonji Out campaign as far back as 2015. Global in scope, its vestiges could be seen in the signs still posted in 2020 in church doorways and gates. Online, an astounding range of blogs, cafes, video channels, and group chat rooms run by former members, support groups, church organizations, anti-heretical centers, religious scholars, and impassioned atheist influencers fulminated a discourse about the dangerous infectiousness of Shincheonji's recruitment and indoctrination tactics. This diagnostic rhetoric was then crystallized in a massive 2-volume March 2020 publication, which you see there, Shincheonji Vaccine, written by theologian Yang Hyungju, who, like myself, was partly trained at UC Irvine, which detailed the disingenuousness of the movement's self-narrated origins and formulated a doctrinal system through which to heal and inoculate those who had fallen into its clutches. This vast discursive production, which gave the lie to the near ubiquitous assertions about the church's shadowy mystery that would headline stories in 2020, would function as an archive of information, rhetoric, and expertise uncannily fit to the panic around the coronavirus. Broadcast media would be inundated with older multi-part epic documentary reports or new productions replete with live action recreations or animated illustrations of the means of viral infection, both theological and biological. Social media became frantic with speculations about the outings of possible congregants, supplemented by keen programmers who developed apps to geolocate Shincheonji facilities and push alerts about potential contamination. Foreign media, until March, still riven by racist and culturalist assumptions about COVID-19, was spiked by variously fervid and presumptuous reports about the church's disturbing practices. A report in Foreign Policy blustered, quote, Shincheonji's bad theology makes for worse public health. Shincheonji teaches illness is a sin, encouraging its followers to suffer through diseases, to attend services in which they sit closely together, breathing in spittle as they repeatedly amen in unison. Stop sharing that. Keep reading. The action around Shincheonji did not remain abstract or rhetorical. On February 24th, just 6 days after the diagnosis of case 31, the Disease Control and Prevention Agency requested a full unmasked contact list, replete with residential registration numbers of all Tegu congregants. Even before the church can render that information, Gyeonggi Provisional Police, under the authorization of a Disease Control and Prevention Act article amended following the 2015 MERS outbreak, without warrant seized hard drives and computers from the Gwacheon City Shincheonji headquarters, ostensibly to verify the Tegu branch submissions and to expand the scope of tracking not only nationwide, but also to the organization's global networks in China, Southeast Asia, and North America. Discrepancies between the submitted rosters and seized information were immediately publicized and led to informal and official accusations of sabotage and public welfare. The most vociferous charge was made by the then Seoul City Mayor Park Won-sun, who demanded prosecution of Shincheonji leadership for, quote, murder, injury, and violation of the law on prevention and management of infectious diseases. In a remarkable turn, the church choreographed a press conference. I need to share this image. A press conference during which Lee Man-hee, variously contrite and ornery, offered a public apology and pledge to cooperate with the ongoing investigations and mitigation initiatives. A performance marred by public fixation on the gold watch worn by Lee, identified as a gift of former and disgraced President Park Geun-hye, and interpreted as a coded gesture of assorted conspiracies. Lee was ultimately arrested on July 31st for obstructing public health efforts and charged with the submission of false information. Though he was, following months of imprisonment, acquitted by the Suwon City District Court, the greater weight of public appraisal had already fallen. As early as February 24th, over 550,000 people signed an online Blue House presidential petition demanding the dissolution of what it termed a radical cult. This was followed by an untold number of smaller petitions and online campaigns calling for punitive action. This was only the most recent, though arguably most spectacular episode in which a new religious movement became entangled in political and social affairs in modern Korea. And the longer paper from which this talk is drawn, I detail a number of these, including the 2014 revelations that came to light around the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, of the Yongsegyo, or Church of the Spirit, which is a new religious movement led by Che Tae-min, who is the father of Che Seung-sil, the Rasputin-like figure around Park Geun-hye. That same year, with the Sewol ferry tragedy, that quickly turned up the connection with Guwonpa, the Salvation sect, and who Yu Bian was the leader there, was also sort of connected with the 1987 Odaeung incident, one of the darker events around new religious movements in Korea, in which 33 members of a group were found dead in apparent murder-suicide pact. I also detail, in a fairly schematic way, histories of the Unification Church and the Olive Tree movement, sort of robust, mostly global religious movements that really intensified in the post-war period. Also, I sort of do a comparative reflection on the historical and political conditions of modern new religious movements, and particularly sort of reflecting on the secular entanglements of new religions, and in particular the marginalization of these movements through networked religious institutions. So I'll keep reading. This is a third section: conversion, brainwashing, and networks. The stubborn nub in all of the theological approaches to new religions, the broad majority of even the psychological, sociological, and vernacular modes of thinking about them, is that new religions are a system or a symptom of some disturbance in need of reconciliation, if not a cure. It is one of the simple wagers of this talk that it is conversion as a set of social, rhetorical, and spatial technologies, and as a means of radical familial, somatic, and ultimately political transformations that aligns the disciplinary force of otherwise only loosely connected fields and disaffiliated thinkers against new religions. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to offer something like a working definition of conversion and brainwashing, which I've developed in the course of a broader study of colonial and post-colonial juridical and literary practices, Cold War era psychology and behaviorism, and the political and vernacular discourses around radicalization. Conversion figures as a dramatic shift, even reversal from previously held worldviews, political positions, and religious beliefs. The underlying presumption is that the previously held position was organically attached to some fundamental factors of personal development, family, school, or nation, and fixed deeply over time, or conversely rooted deeply in a dramatic and transformative event affecting psychological, cognitive, and neurological processing. Against this background, conversion applies in the political sphere as a renunciation of previous political affiliation, belief, connection, and technique, and an embrace of new political affiliation, or the turn to ostensibly non-political attachments and institutions, or the renunciation of politics altogether. The formalism of this process is amply demonstrated in the strict conventions through which ideological affiliations were sworn and renounced before and after the war, that is the Korean War, and at the dawn of neoliberal restructuring. Sorry about that. Conversion is only applied politically in the context of substantial external pressure or historical transformation. It is therein split between an act arising from coercion and a voluntary act. In fact, the political importance of conversion turns on the question of what motivated it and the degree of its sincerity, which is to say, the degree to which it matches or exceeds the organic attachment from which it turns. Its form is public, conventional, and declarative, enacted through an array of statements in which the error, emptiness, and harm of the past attachment are overturned through a recognition of the exclusive truth and health of the new attachment. Conversion's language is individualized, biographical, and agentive, and is articulated through both robust narrativized description of the movement from the past to the present and didactic declarations of the necessity and benefit that can arise from the conversion. Joe, can you hear that fior-de-lis backup sound? Anyway. Brainwashing, on the other hand, figures a similarly dramatic shift in political consciousness. So the means of conceptualizing that political consciousness cannot be decoupled from broad assumptions about the mechanisms and psychology of religious faith. But rather than being split between external coercion and internal volition, brainwashing's fundamental split is between external coercion and internalized coercion. The question of authenticity then is not about whether the new consciousness is performed opportunistically, but about the degree to which the subject is aware of the conversion to which he or she is subject. In other words, and especially for the psychiatrists debating the subject through the late 1960s, brainwashing is always coercive, though it may be experienced as a voluntary state. Like conversion, brainwashing can be ascribed to a long-term and diffuse developmental process, whether that is in the home or outside in the school, church, or public organization. Unlike conversion, this process is construed as contravening social norms, historically appropriate conditions, or even organically rooted truths. That is, it stems from an unnatural, corrupted, manipulative, outdated, or erroneous grasp of the world. Brainwashing's overturning, therefore, is rarely, if ever, carried out as a voluntary or accidental process of illumination, as when the converted confronts changed realities, but rather as an externally mandated revision, elimination, and reprogramming. Brainwashing is a state from which one can only be forcefully returned to normality, health, and reason. Conversion is a process through which one declares a reorientation to sanctioned and reasonable modes of political discourse. Brainwashing is described in language that is diagnostic, quasi-scientific, and ethnographic, and as such haunts the edges of the study of groups, i.e. sociology, culture in anthropology, and mind in psychology and cognitive science. It is presumed to exist and flourish under conditions of isolation and non-communication. Countering it, therefore, requires the intervention of commensurate environmental enclosure through which the contradictions of the prior position and state are highlighted by the recognition of the flexibility, heterogeneity, and freedom of the normative reality. It is the otherwise unmarked subject damaged by secularized and postmodern society and made suggestible and therein susceptible to the manipulations of charismatic bad actors that is the pathologized object foregrounded in anti-cultist discourse and practice. The corrupt doctrinal and biochemical virality that saturated the broad public response to Shincheonji surfaced the disciplinary resonance between the largely conservative theological prescriptions for evangelism and ministry and a network of social, scientific, and popular discourses about the importance of family harmony, the transparency of political and religious institutions, and the importance of discipline in schoolwork and even leisure. But it also opened up an area for thinking about conversion, brainwashing, and religion. That is, the ritual materiality, spatial distribution, and technological mediation of organizational control networks. A topographical plotting of these networks might help to chart, without resort to the language of pathologization, heresy, and criminalization, the means of conversion within the movement, and further to more creatively reflect on the contemporary materialities of belief. In the chapter, I sort of there go on to detail sort of these, what I call these anxious genealogies of anti-cultism, which really reached a boiling point in the 70s and 80s, not coincidentally, around fears of Asian cults intervening in North American and European religious practice. And I also dive into what's perhaps a much too long and detailed survey of the modern history of religious studies as an academic field in Korea, from its advent in the colonial period to its complex institutionalization in the present. Key here is the long continuity of classificatory systems for new religions that remain durable, from approximately the 20s to about the 90s, which classified new religions as variously pseudo, Yusa, New Rising, Shincheonji, and later heterodox, heretical, Idan, pseudos, Haibi, and in some cases even Tagyo, evil. Critical here is the fateful split between sociological and theological institutional structures in the study of Christian movements. This is, because I kind of went so deeply into this, is kind of interesting for me, but perhaps a little bit tangential to the talk, and so I'll skip over that part. And do something perhaps a tick more entertaining. So I'm going to share, go back to sharing. Hopefully this will pop up. Thinking about new religions and materiality, am I sharing? Does anyone see this? Yes, okay. Takes me to both materiality, or space as materiality, and then communications media. And to close the paper, we'll sort of think about the nexus between these two things. But these are just a couple of images recently. This was the Guompa headquarters just after, months after the prosecution of Yu Bian. This was a real spectacle at that time. I'm going to skip over this, or to move fairly quickly. The Guompa compound was this sprawling commune which had its own economy, agrarian systems, etc., and erected a really, as you saw in that first image, quite spectacular defense, attempting to protect not only its members, but particularly Yu Bian. Thinking about other ways in which Guompa was really imbricated in the secular world, and particularly in media aesthetics. These revelations came out almost immediately about Yu Bian's other life, not only as an entrepreneur and religious leader, but as a photographer. These are images of, this is a website which is still live, despite the fact that he ostensibly died in 2014. I don't really have time to detail, but it's quite fascinating that there were massive retrospectives of his photographic work in museums and art galleries across North America and Europe. All the photographs were taken from the compound, his studio in the compound. And you can still purchase these collections of his photography for really stunning amounts of money. The foundation even moved into various health and well-being technologies and product sales, including air purification systems, water purification, etc. This belongs to this whole other nexus of New Age spirituality and new religious movements that I find quite fascinating, but I don't have quite time to detail them here. Another dimension of the new religious and media materialities nexus is, of course, in mechanical reproduction medias. These are images taken from Yongsegyo, or the Victory Altar, which was another new religious movement, which I think earlier in 2021 also made the news because it became yet another vector for COVID-19 spread. But earlier it was known for its evangelism and through the capture of what they called the Holy Dew on film. Can you see some images of it here? Again, don't have time to really detail what that's about, but they even went to a professional analyst in the States who determined that, in fact, the holy dew effects in the photographs could not be attributed to any manipulation, etc. So there was a tremendous investment in the sort of mechanical reproduction of the doctrinal elements of the religion. Perhaps closer to the, I'm going to go back. It might be surprising that organizations like these, especially Shincheonji, are also incredibly savvy, both in social media manipulations and instrumentalization, and in their production of films. They, in fact, have a whole series of anti-forced conversion films, the first minute of which one I'll play here.
좋았어. 이대로만 된다면 아주 완벽한 시나리오야.
I don't know, I'm sorry, I can't remember if I optimized for video and sound there, but it's no matter. I mean, it's just, so this is a film which details the machinations of a Protestant minister who has a plan to convert Shincheonji members and through capture and essentially a kind of brainwashing. So it's kind of fascinating to me how the figure of brainwashing is deployed equally by anti-cultists and by the new religious movements themselves. And this story sort of details a plucky Shincheonji member who manages through her study to counter the forced conversion measures of this ostensibly well-meaning minister. Anyway, stop sharing and go on to my last fairly long section here. So hopefully I'll be able to squeeze this in. So returning to the subject at hand. So how do members of Shincheonji inhabit and move through space? And what are the forms of mediation in which this emplacement is enabled? This is a question which demands theoretical reflection on how bodies and culture flow through states of deterritorialization and reterritorialization, and ultimately how those flows confer or withdraw legitimacies to claim the right to inhabit, to reassemble, to believe. But at this juncture, the more urgent task is to track with as much detail and to the furthest extent possible the material forms by which the church organizes itself and through which its activities are performed. Coercive or voluntary, empirical or occult, conceptual or ritual, religious conversion happens in spaces of inhabitation and through networks of communication. Like many other Orthodox and mainstream New Christian movements, Shincheonji transgresses national and linguistic borders. Its robust evangelical network, moving out of Korea principally to China, but radiating out to Southeast Asia and outposts in Europe and North America, was of course preceded by the sprawling transnational associations of the Unification Church, among others. But Shincheonji's occupation of transnational territories, likely owing to both the nimbler logistics that technological advancements have afforded and the figurative postures that the church has had to take, has assumed a more cellular, capillary, and networked quality than its intrepid predecessors. The spaces that host Bible studies, prayer meetings, and annual festivities, the dissemination of news, and new learning materials, the welcome of envoys from Korea, and the recruitment of new members are largely not recognizable or registered spaces of worship, but private spaces, after hours retail spaces, unmarked or deceptively marked offices, warehouse, or otherwise commercial spaces. Scheduling, encouragement, and discipline flow through closed online group chat platforms, through channels for sourcing less private information about the church, goes through accessible websites hosted locally and in Korea. I'll start sharing screen once again. This mode of operations is appropriate to the comparatively small scale of the movement. It's estimated that even the largest contingent outside of Korea and China may count less than 24,000 members, and the financial and regulatory limitations it faces in various contexts. But that more pragmatic strategy is broken by the international events and organizational bodies that pull global members out of the cellular networks and into mass gatherings in Korea and elsewhere. These include this annual or semi-annual events hosted in stadiums and replete with large-scale gymnastics performances. They have gone by various names, the All Nations Conference or Mangukhae, or officially the Heavenly Culture Mass Games and the World Peace Forum. Or in this case, if you squint your eyes there, you might see this is called, believe it or not, the WARP Summit. World Association, I think, for Religion's Peace, the WARP. Anyway, and the mostly ad hoc mobilizations that the broad range of organizing bodies, the International Peace Youth Group, International Women's Peace Groups, etc., all coordinate. A similar, more elaborate and heterogeneous network of spaces defines Shincheonji within Korea itself. One of the issues that invited the most vociferous attacks on the church is the utilization of spaces by congregations under pseudonymous names, signage, auspices, and registration, the so-called disguised churches or 미조 교회. Identified and archived by former members and whistleblowers, though not fully verified by independent police authority. This practice typically fronts with the name of one of the many iterations a Protestant church might take: Happiness Church, Love Church, Hope Church, Heavenly Hope Church, First West River Church, Vision Center, et cetera, registers as the cultural or educational facilities of a larger mainstream organization, and foregrounds through banners and posted flyers, both the secular and religious activities such as readings, counseling, and cooking classes that are ostensibly programmed in them. These are most commonly set up in medium-sized buildings zoned for office, commercial, and even residential rental, often the so-called neighborhood commercial facilities, the Kulinchishar. You can kind of see one instance of that at the very top of that building there, which means the buildings themselves are dense with heterogeneous tenants that can range from cram schools to small food shops, design offices to cafes. They are mostly then unremarkable installations in otherwise nondescript urban contexts, although they stage weekly or more frequent services on a neighborhood, if not district scale. On a smaller scale, but apparently greater in number, are an array of centers, gospel or Bible study rooms, so-called 보금방, and meeting rooms, 모임방, that seem to blanket almost indiscriminately neighborhoods throughout the major urban centers in Korea. These tend to go by even more featureless names, i.e. Multicultural Center, Peace Academy Center, Leaders Academy, Study Room, etc., and take the form of the prolifically expanding private cram schools, hobby rooms, health facilities, and specialty interests spaces that lend cities their near incomprehensible density. By the way, I'm actually in one of those specialty interest spaces as we speak now. While finer distinctions in the precise function of each of these spaces is possible, an easier generalization is that they house gatherings of between 3 and 10 people for Bible study, regular group lectures, and more informal reading and gathering. They may also function as temporary residential spaces for newer members in the late stages of their training, while more formalized living facilities and even neighboring apartment blocks accommodate more established congregants. It is, of course, these myriad spaces and the regular covert and undocumented meetings that they convene that proved to be the most vexing sites of coronavirus contagion in early 2020. Even despite their large physical scale, the primary regional Shincheonji church facilities are distinctly dissimilar to the often monumental structures of churches and cathedrals of similar or smaller organizational scale that spike Korean urban landscapes. Its first headquarters in Anyang, largely windowless and low-ceilinged, were shared in the building with a sprawling department store on the lower floors. Its next and current home, which you see here in Gwacheon, is a solely owned 10-story building that is better fit to the scope of services and operations, though it too looks less like a church than a corporate headquarters or perhaps even an urban prison. One of the hallmarks of this, as well as the other regional headquarters, are the wide open, full floor and virtually unfurnished halls, that host the largest services. Again, these became scenes of anxiety for the public health officials and archival footage viewers for the extreme proximity of the congregants to each other, kneeling on mats with nothing to separate them. But perhaps the most indelible image from that period and of Shincheonji altogether is that of the Tegu Headquarters. Massive, monolithic, and constituted by alternating levels of metallic cladding and impenetrable blue glass, it is nevertheless unremarkable, just as easily a container for small offices or a large corporation, or perhaps even a hybrid opisthera. The subject of extended apprehensive gazing in early media coverage of the pandemic and then reduced to serve as a sort of shorthand reference to vectors of contagion, the building manifested the anonymized threat, proximate but invisible, of both the virus and the church. But it's perhaps the movement of Shincheonji's congregants and the networks through which life is organized that more cogently synthesizes the force of contagion and conversion. Most threatening to other more established groups is the figure of the so-called harvester or reaper, the so-called chusukgun, the evangelist or apostle whose primary mission is to seek the salvation of congregants among Protestant churches. First through the lure of more devoted Bible study, and then by introduction to the networks of communication through the spaces surveyed above. Progressive steps towards the more revelatory doctrine are taken over the course of months and through the aid of an elaborate curriculum of textbooks full of incrementally rewarding diagrams and puzzles, supplemented by increasing levels of the social and media isolation ostensibly needed to master the curriculum. These are images taken from Shincheonji textbooks, which are widely available online through these anti-Shincheonji blogs. Once through a series of exams and onto progressively more robust contact with greater members of congregants and larger facilities, the newly full-fledged member is imbricated into a fully self-sufficient economy within the church. Parallel to all the conventional functions of capitalist finance and exchange, the economy unfolds the sale of books, food, clothing, fitness memberships, automobile, home and insurance plans, and even mortgages. I'm sorry, I realize I'm getting very close, if not already over the time. So I'm going to skip over this little part that details the sort of legal troubles that the church fell into to read these last 2 paragraphs. In this story lies an implicit critique of both disciplinary and control societies, whose dark forces have been highlighted and even accelerated in the course of the pandemic, but rationalized through the public health and moral dangers presented by entities like Shincheonji. But more relevant to the concerns of this talk, the network of spaces and mediated practices sketched above furnishes a possible alternative to the reductive psychologism, soft sociology, and even the reflexive behaviorism that have stubbornly grounded both scholarly and vernacular discourses around religious conversion and brainwashing. Can such a management and navigation of space with its attendant enclosures of communication and its mediation of experiences, discrete from those conditioned by the regulatory apparatus, can this management of spaces be said to convert? New religious movements are striking for the contradictory ways that they straddle what has been elaborated by two distinct but intimately connected forms of power, which we might think of as the biopolitical and the neoliberal, or the disciplinary and the control forms. Groups like Shincheonji can be read first as a form of retrogressive resistance to disciplinary power in elaborating a milieu and technology that violate the regulatory frameworks of liberal societies. Destabilizing families, erecting an economic, educational, and belief architecture parallel to, but outside the mainstream, and tactically establishing a network of spaces and media that attempts to elude surveillance and control. In these operations, they are not far different from subcultural or radical political organizations, disruptive, elusive, and often cellular in form. Groups like Shincheonji, though, are often at the same time deeply conservative politically and socially, and apparently retrogressive in their management of bodies, resources, and ideas. But the movements embody an analogy, or perhaps a distilled archetype of the workings of contemporary forms of power that fold into themselves practices and ideals of freedom, self-fulfillment, self-realization, and desires through what the political theorist Byung-Chul Han calls a psychopolitical shutting in. Through a control of the protocols of the body and the information networks in which they move, groups like Shincheonji advance the ultimate freedom and fulfillment, i.e. salvation, as the condition for the technologies of the self. That these are centralized around the doctrine of the church and of charismatic leadership is clearly primary to both the internal discipline of the church and to its dangerous image outside of it. But in my mind, the more fascinating and perhaps generative aspect of its operations is precisely their form, the relative independence of the established congregants acting in their viral way to recruit new believers, the resourcefulness through which cells organize to navigate urban and global spaces and global regulations, the lateral, and we might even use the term rhizomatic vectors, through which information and resources and pedagogical materials are distributed and shared both physically and digitally. These present the most troubling parallel to the intensifying architecture of networked power today. That's it. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you so much, Steve. That was incredible. So let me just invite the audience to use the Q&A function down below to ask questions. I have, maybe I could just start us out while people are beginning to formulate questions. God, I have a lot to say about this talk. This is really fascinating, Steve. I mean, I guess I have a complicated question that's couched in something of a naive one. And I just kept thinking the naive part of the question is like, why is, I'm not even directing this towards you. I just was sort of thinking like, why is Steve interested in this topic? You know, and it seems, you know, and just as a way for me to sort of like find my way into the talk, you know, there's a kind of historical answer to that, right? And that's really fascinating in and of its own right. But the theoretical parts are really compelling. And it seems to me that like, what's amazing about what you're doing, and I totally agree with your description up front, that's kind of strange and weird, and but all in the best ways, is that you're, you know, that the opening premise seems something like that the virus makes something or the experience of the virus, the coronavirus, makes something very clear about new religions. It actually just, and it's more than just a metaphor. It's, that was often used as, the viral spread is like, religious conversion or something, but it's actually a little something more deep and profound about it. And it's almost like the sense I got was that your really primary insight is more about apparatus. And that what is machinic about new religions, so you're very interested in what is machinic and what is medial about new religions, but equally interested in what's religious about machinery, right? If that makes sense, and to use that as a kind of chiasmic formulation. And it seems that like part of what you're getting at is something that's always kind of elusive. Like I think we have lots of accounts of media and the spread of media through via Latour, et cetera, as network, through these kinds of network logics, but they never quite get at that aspect of media that's captivating and like converting, like these kinds of quasi-religious experiences. And I love the kind of dyad between conversion and brainwashing. So I guess the complicated question in the naive one is about apparatus. Is like, and I'm thinking I guess the question would be like, is that kind of like, is this like a kind of apparatus project? Are you trying to get at something fundamental about the way media and media networks work through Shincheonji and new religions in general? Or am I completely missing the boat and it's more in these other kinds of directions? I mean, it does go in a lot of different directions at once.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's totally bang on. But that's like a direction that just dawned on me as I was writing. In fact, not even before the research for this particular chapter. And to kind of answer, to shade into your opening question, which is like how did I even wind up going from writing about post-war film to writing about this topic? I mean, in the course of my study on like post-war cultural discourse and politics, as a kind of contextualizing framework for thinking about post-war cinema, I came across a lot of these sort of narratives in literature and film, sort of foregrounding some kind of political conversion. Right? And I wrote about this a little bit in this kind of Enlightenment discourse that happens in a number of different directions towards a kind of modern conversions to communism and vice versa. So I was always sort of really interested in the centrality of minds changing in a dramatic, but also sometimes sort of instrumental way through their representations in literature and other cultural production. And that was kind of like the genesis for this project in a way, sort of to trace like, media representations, and even to a lesser extent, like to some extent, like the instrumentalization of media in the kind of conversion, brainwashing, confessional mode. So in fact, the first chapter of this kind of proposed book looks at a number of different moments in the late colonial period, in the early post-war period, and then into the so-called like post-political IMF, post democratic movement period of the 90s, the period that you're more familiar with. Of these confessionals, right? Sort of renouncing some earlier political passions and embracing, what is ostensibly a kind of, pure life, non-ideological life, right? But looking at, so this sort of way in which like certain kinds of like religious discourse were invoked in these political confessionals, and in particular their representation in film and literature was like the starting point for this work. But yeah, halfway through writing this chapter, I became much more intrigued by the the way in which a kind of media materiality, or as you mentioned, a kind of thinking the apparatus could transform or revise the way in which religion and belief and political commitment could be sort of, conceptualized, period, right? And, it should go without saying that, I'm not the first to broach this subject. There's whole sort of scholarly interventions around media and religion, the links between a kind of new spiritualism and media. And, parallel to that, sort of thinking the materiality of religion away from doctrinal, theological sort of assumptions has been, arguably the dominant sort of method from what I've been able to glean in religious studies, for at least the last, couple of decades. And part of that is to sort of work against the intellectualism, the psychologism, and even the hard or sort of soft scientific, soft sociological sort of reckonings with religious experience, right? In the paper, I take some deep inspiration from what the anthropologist Johannes Fabian once wrote about religions, which is that once we attempt to either contextualize sociologically or doctrinally the religious experience, we've already kind of destroyed it, right? And so in a way, thinking about like spaces, media in its its broadest sense, not just digital media or social media, but the ways in which bodies sort of interact with urban space and from urban space to chat rooms to sort of legal restrictions around gathering, etc., I think was a more interesting way for me to understand exactly the process through which these new religious members began to experience like transformations in consciousness, right? And because virtually all the other ways that I encountered of accounting for transformation, a conversion to new religious movements, or vice versa, like the deprogramming from like this cult organization, were all like deeply dissatisfying, right? So yeah, that is certainly kind of part of the exploration here. Yeah, your formulation, what is machinic about religion, is like bang on. I don't know if what I tended to do is like adequate to that formulation, but that's certainly the kind of direction I want to sort of head in. So yeah, thanks very much.
Well, it certainly gets at. I mean, I think what it was surprising to me about the talk was how it circles around a lot of discussions in media studies, media theory, from a completely different angle. And it's almost like media archaeology in the sense that, we think about these modern technologies, contemporary technologies, in much longer time frames. So you think about like the codex as like media and what that means, the entailments of that. But rather than going scaling out in time, it's sort of like it feels like this is like a different, it's obviously in the contemporary moment, but it's a different order of media experience that makes something clear about media that we wouldn't really otherwise see. So I kept thinking of like the language you just used for brainwashing is, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about brainwashing and that relationship between conversion and brainwashing. I think, you just use the word programming or deprogramming to think about brainwashing as, and, like the obvious kind of machinic instrumentality of that term. I actually, I know that you, I'm not sure if you're still working on the project about the Cold War. I was thinking about something like The Manchurian Candidate is a story about brainwashing in which he turns into, I forgot if this language is used, but he turns into a killing machine. There's a way in which the brainwashing narrative is interestingly parallel, but obviously, as you point out, different. to the logic of conversion. And like, I wonder if that's the sort of ghost in the machine here. Like there's that, what's interesting about that diet is that how it so freely oscillates back and forth between these kinds of agential responses to religion and media, and then also totally mechanistic responses. Yeah, so I mean, I apologize that that's not formulated as a clear question, but I just wonder if you could talk a little bit through those two terms and how they're a little bit more about how they're interacting for you.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to embed it in a slightly more concrete way. Yeah, certainly. I mean, what's interesting about like the Manchurian Candidate is that it centers essentially around research and like public discourse and even hysteria. So all of that, right? Religious discourse, like sort of early sort of behaviorist sociology, public sort of anxiety about the war, precisely from Korea, right? The puppet master in that film is ethnic Chinese, but it happens in a Korean War POW, right? So I think these are very much folded together. The sort of a racialization and a kind of fear of like the automaton, which sort of is aligned with, or in a way becomes like the central figure of brainwashing, right? The hollowing out, which is, I mean, let me be as clear as possible here. I mean, brainwashing is a kind of like quasi-scientific, deeply instrumentalized, political discourse, which is precisely a kind of Cold War figuration. So the other concrete sort of vector of that is precisely the way it's figured in anti-cultist discourse, like today. So you have often like parents and spouses of people who have converted to Shincheonji or another, a religious organization. And time and again, I mean, I'm just thinking about the Korean sort of literature on this. These families articulate, the loss of these family members as a kind of hollowing out, like their eyes are empty, they sort of behave in mechanical ways, and either only go through the motions of what they sort of were previously, or abandon like their social roles altogether, right? So in a way, it's kind of dusting off or sort of renewing these sort of tropes about the sort of mechanization that religious transformations, apparently sort of condition. Yeah, but in a sense, I mean, the book to which from which this chapter is drawn is precisely trying to sort of think through all the ways in which brainwashing and its kind of double conversion work through a number of different, there's even a chapter there where I think about the histories of behaviorism with it and their appropriation in Korean sociology. So yeah, it's an extremely complex kind of history that I can only sort of compress here. So.
Actually, we have a question that's kind of an extension of that. So this is from Chung. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Obviously, this is part of an upcoming book. First of all, what is the title? And is this the overall theme of your research? There's a plethora of studies on new religion. What distinguishes yours from the existing study other than the logistics of brainwashing / conversion? And I actually, in that answer, I invite you just to talk a little bit more about the shape of the book and the ambitions of the book.
Yeah. First of all, a warm hello to Chung. This is what I forgot in my nervousness to mention, that what's so special about being invited back to UCI is to sort of engage, see again. I wish I could see again, but all my teachers from Irvine. So it's terrific to quote unquote see you again, Chung. Yeah, it's part of an upcoming book. I don't have a title. It really should have been published already, according to my bosses. So I can say something about the various chapters. There are already mosquitoes here. So the first chapter is tracing, as I sort of mentioned briefly in response to Joe's question, various moments in which writing was enlisted as the media of confession, conversion, and political disavowal. So primarily these prison narratives, which were written in the late colonial period, then by refugees from North Korea shortly after, or during and shortly after the Korean War, and then, as I mentioned, this line of formerly militant, enthusiastic political activists from variously the sort of labor and democracy movements. Disavowing, as part of a kind of neoliberal transformation that began arguably in the early 90s or so, and renunciation of left politics and full embrace of neoconservative politics in South Korea, who it's very commonly known then many of these who write these articles. Books become some of the leading figures of the initially the kind of new right movement in Korea, and then into electoral politics. The second chapter sort of foregrounds gender in the kind of conversion narratives and sort of brainwashing discourses around mostly North Koreans, beginning with the 87. See you later. Of Kim Hyun-hee, the 1987 Korean Airlines North Korean terrorist / bomber, who, for those of you who don't know, might not be familiar with the story, is captured and tried for terrorism, murder, etc., but then acquitted, very interestingly, on the charge that she, in fact, was brainwashed by North Korea and could therein, in her encounters with free, democratic, advanced, modern South Korea, be deprogrammed from that North Korean. And she, interestingly, goes on to, enjoy a fairly precarious but prolific career as an author and political figure. And then I sort of try to make some connections with the Hanawan resettlement work with North Korean defectors. Again, as instances of cultural and political conversion. And the final chapter, which would follow this chapter on religion, sort of thinks about, what is like we're all sort of anxious or worried about today, polarization or radicalization, ostensibly through new media structures, and in this case, in Korea. There's no title, so it sort of meditates on these various moments historically and contextually in which brainwashing, conversion are involved, both legally and sort of intellectually. But Jungwoo, your question about what would distinguish this study from other research on new religions is something that it was maybe would have surfaced a little bit more clearly if I had sort of moved through the section on new religious studies in Korean scholarship, which I would sort of reduce from its vast complexity to a fairly simple schematic, which is that what I found in the now very many journals, religious studies journals in Korea, and even whole journals dedicated to new religions, is that first, there's a strong bifurcation between so-called nativist new religions, Cheondogyo, Jungsamdo, etc., and Christian-affiliated new religious groups. And that the vast majority of research on new religions in Korea seems to revolve around these so-called nativist groups, with relatively little about new religious groups and Christian-affiliated new religious groups. And the ones that I've seen are mostly the scholarly papers on Christian new religious movements that I've seen. And I'm actually be very curious to know whether this is actually true or not. But I feel like I did my due diligence working through many of these journals. Is that the research on Christian new religious movements is mostly by theologians writing in the theologically oriented Protestant and Catholic journals, right? So in a sense, this is not unprecedented work. I mean, there's all kinds of historical research. Tak Myung-won is a prolific author about the histories of Christian new religious movements in Korea. But he's coming from a very committed theological perspective. So I think I'm trying to carve out a space for thinking about Christian affiliated new religions. Not only through the methodological sort of orientation that Joe and I talked about a little bit earlier, but one that doesn't belong to either of these two dominant methodological approaches to new religions, i.e. through the nativist or the sort of theological approaches. I don't know if that's a kind of satisfying or even sort of complete answer, but that's kind of where I sit right now. So thanks again.
So we have a question from Heather Melquist Leto. I'm wondering if you see these material structures as being more distinctive to new religious movements in Korea, or if this might be more generally a dynamic common to Reformed Protestant-style religious groups under modern secularism. I ask because outside of new religious movements more likely to be seen as Saibi or Idan, these more capillary or infrastructural logics may be seen throughout large Protestant movements. For example, in South Korea alone, we can note Yeoye Dosun Bokum Gyoe's popularization of cell groups, as well as Sarang Yegyoe's description of their megachurch as holy infrastructure. But this is also observable in Christianity outside Korea as well.
That's a great question. I'm just trying to sort of zero in on what the precise question is. You see this as being more distinctive to new religious movements. Oh, I mean, this is the first time hearing of these two megachurch. I don't know what to call these tactics or methods. These sort of smaller cellular structures. So yeah, that's terrific. I mean, Heather, I don't know, this is so weird that we don't have this interactivity. Yeah, I mean, I've learned, in fact, from work that you've done in the past, that I've actually seen, I think, an interview, is that right? That you did with Stallo. You can put it in the chat. I can't remember, Jeffrey Stallo, I can't remember. But which, yeah, I found terrific as a way of sort of thinking about the cross implications of media and religion precisely along this way. So I would kind of, my research into this area is not nearly as comprehensive enough to determine whether, this is exclusive to new religious movements, right? It's, even here, but so it's a kind of like, it's a beginning research, and it's one that's kind of, confined to sort of personal experience and a kind of recency of the ways in which new religious movements have become, so spectacularized, over the course of the pandemic. right? But just walking around Seoul, there are all kinds of these spaces which are ambiguous, right? I mean, not only in the ways that sometimes like cafes look like galleries or whatever it is, right? But these, just up the street here in Princeton, there's a building which, has language which refers to some kind of like gathering and spiritualism that, because I was doing this research I was curious about, and turns out it's like a Christianized movement that put its roots in Seoul in the the early 1940s. But on the surface, it can look like a a private house, or maybe a kind of Buddhist meditation space or something, right? So certainly, I think the way in which these new religious movements occupy space and take advantage of the communication networks, digitally, and obviously before that, analog media seemed qualitatively different than what has become sort of what you would know best, Heather, the sort of hallmark of religious institutions in Korea, which is either the mega church or the red crucifixes, the neon crucifixes, which would dot the Seoul skyline at night. I would say that in so my historical research about these older new religious movements in Korea, i.e. the Olotri movement and Unification Church, and to a certain extent Guompa, is arguably in a way like the last vestige of that kind of organizational form of the new religious church, had a different kind of spatiality, right? Which you saw a glimpse of there, which is like the compound, or even the freestanding commune, or sort of, it's almost a separate city, right? Each one of these organizations had something like this. Mostly, despite the fact that a lot of the congregants were urbanites, you have these massive sprawling complexes in each of these new religious organizations, in suburbs or in rural areas, and that seems to be a kind of like spatialization which has shifted to one that is, I was trying to detail here, much more tightly imbricated in a sense, like just beneath the surface of urban life. But that's a terrific tip about the mega churches and their kind of, what I'm assuming are kind of lesser known operations. So thank you very much.
Stephen, if you can just indulge me in one final question, and maybe this is at just one scale wider than Heather's last question. I was thinking about your comments about the connection between some of these new religious groups and the new right in Korea, and I wonder if this may forgive me if this is too broad, but I wonder if this project, throughout the course of this project, you've gotten a chance to think about whether or not this lends any insight into new right-wing groups more generally, right-wing extremism in particular, and the way they work, is that a context in which that this helps us think about, that your project helps us think about?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I kind of hope so, but I'm not quite there yet. As I mentioned, that's basically going to be the topic of the fourth and final chapter. And clearly well, maybe, I don't know. It seems like the question of like digital media's conditioning of like polarization seem to be anticipated as a profound like political and social anxiety in Korea, around the 2014 impeachment especially, and thereafter. I mean, the really remarkable, I don't know if to call it a backlash, but these groups that are, perhaps like regaining like even more force today, 7 years after the impeachment, attempting to, instrumentalize media and recuperate Park Geun-hye's image. So anyway, what I mean to say is that the ways in which these right-wing movements felt victimized, marginalized by the broader public push around the impeachment, which then manifested in all of these kinds of sort of capillary, networked, forms, which can maybe be distilled in the difference between, say, like, Facebook and what seems to be the dominant mode of communication amongst these conservative groups, which are these private or private group, like Katok, like these communication app, messenger app group chats, right? So the ways in which that sort of eludes any kind of like ostensible public visibility or broader visibility. Really seemed to attain a kind of force around 2014 and 2015, i.e. well before, the height of the panic around like, alt-right and, new right, Trumpism, etc., came to the fore, arguably around 2016, 2017, are still with us today. So yeah, that's essentially the hope. Right, but I suppose in a sense I would be very wary of sort of attempting to frame the research that I'm sort of beginning to do as a means of understanding like right-wing movements, because from what the research that I've done historically has shown that in fact the specter of brainwashing and political conversion is mostly bipartisan, right? It's not, it doesn't belong to any kind of ideological orientation. So I think that it's precisely the infrastructures and the ways in which media materiality are shaping consciousness need to be understood to flow in multiple directions.
Well, that was really an amazing presentation, Stephen. And the only thing left to say is that I'm just to express my regret that it couldn't be in person, and that to insist that you come visit us soon once we're able to do this live. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate the questions and the discussion. I wish we were more interactive, but hopefully, I've been told we're planning on things in the fall in person, so that's to be something to look forward to. So thank you all for coming.